The solicitor's office was a room scrubbed clean of all sentiment. It smelled of dry paper, beeswax, and the faint, metallic tang of ink, a sterile environment for the sterile transaction taking place. Dust motes danced in the single beam of weak afternoon light slanting from a high, grim window, each one a tiny, indifferent planet in a forgotten galaxy. Alistair, the ninth Duke of Blackwood, watched them, his focus narrowed to their meaningless drift because it was preferable to looking at the two people seated opposite him. He was a man carved from granite and duty, his face a mask of aristocratic ennui that concealed a hollowness so profound it had its own gravitational pull. He had returned from the continent not victorious, but merely finished, the war having scoured him of everything but the titles and obligations he wore like a shroud. This marriage was simply one more clause in a long, tiresome contract with fate. Across the mahogany expanse of the desk sat the girl, Elara Vance. She was a pale slip of a thing, lost in a threadbare dress the color of dishwater. Her hands, raw-boned and chapped, were clenched tightly in her lap, the only sign of the tension that pulled her spine ramrod straight. She had a cough, a dry, persistent rasp that she tried to smother in a thin handkerchief. It was a sound that spoke of damp rooms and poor nourishment, the signature ailment of the genteelly impoverished. Beside her, her uncle, a man whose desperation radiated from him in greasy waves, fidgeted with his hat, his eyes darting between the Duke and the solicitor as if watching a game of high-stakes tennis where his own head was the ball. He was selling his niece, and Alistair was buying. It was as simple and as sordid as that. "The terms are agreeable, Your Grace?" Mr. Hemlock, the solicitor, asked, his voice as dry as the document spread before him. His spectacles were perched on the end of his nose, and he looked down it at the world with the dispassionate air of a man who trafficked in ruin and redemption with equal billing. Alistair did not shift his gaze from the dust motes. They're what they are. A name, a bloodline, however diluted. In exchange for a title and the settlement as stipulated, he had to marry. His grandfather's will was an arcane and spiteful document, a final bit of patriarchal tyranny from beyond the grave. A vast portion of the unentailed Blackwood fortune, the liquid assets he desperately needed to restore lands bled dry by his father's profligacy and his own wartime expenditures, was tied to his marrying a woman with a drop of Tremaine blood. This girl, this Elara Vance, was the last, most distant drop. A Tremaine had married a Vance 3 generations ago, a disastrous union that had produced nothing but debt and obscurity. Until now. Now it produced a duchess. And then a residence? The uncle ventured, his voice cracking with a mixture of avarice and fear. "You did mention Blackwood Manor." Alistair's gaze finally moved, sliding over the uncle with the chilling lack of interest one might afford a piece of furniture. "I did." He then let his eyes fall upon the girl. Her own eyes, a startlingly lucid shade of gray, met his. There was no pleading in them, no girlish fantasy. There was only a cold, hard assessment that was unervingly similar to his own. It was the look of a survivor, and it was the first interesting thing he had noticed about her. She will be the Duchess of Blackwood. She will reside at Blackwood Manor. The funds stipulated in the settlement will be transferred to you upon the conclusion of the ceremony. He did not say your payment. He did not have to. Elara's chin lifted a fraction. The cough rattled in her chest, but her voice, when it came, was clear and cold. "And you, Your Grace? You will not be in residence." It was a direct question, devoid of the coyness or deference he would have expected. It was a question of logistics, not romance. A small, dry part of him approved. "I have matters in London that require my attention. The running of the duchy. Affairs of state." The lie was smooth, practiced. The truth was that he could not bear the thought of staying. He had purchased a wife to fulfill a clause. He had no intention of acquiring a companion. He had duties that were real, that were stone and soil and law, and they were all that kept the gaping void at his center from swallowing him whole. "I see," she said. The two words were utterly flat, an acceptance of fact. She was being bought and banished, and she understood it perfectly. The uncle, sweating now, jumped in. "Elara, My dear, His Grace has immense responsibilities. It is an honor that he entrusts you with such a significant seat as Blackwood Manor. Alara's gaze did not waver from Alistair's. Is it a significant seat, Your Grace? She asked, a faint, almost imperceptible trace of irony in her tone. She knew then. She had heard the rumors. Blackwood Manor was not a prize. It was a tomb, a place of exile. His father had shuttered it decades ago, hating the bleak, northern coast where it stood sentinel over a churning gray sea. It was said to be rotting from the inside out, a monument to neglect. Alistair felt a flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps merely annoyance, at her perception. It is yours, he said, the words a final, dismissive gavel. What you make of it is of no concern to me. He rose, the motion fluid and commanding. The interview was over. The transaction was complete, pending the miserable little ceremony in the vacant church tomorrow. Mr. Hemlock has the papers. Sign them. He turned his back on his future wife and her sweating, sycophantic guardian and walked to the window, staring out at the gray London street. He was thinking of his ledgers, of the reports from his estate managers in the South, of the political machinations he had to navigate at Whitehall. He was thinking of anything and everything but the pale girl with the knowing gray eyes and the quiet, rattling cough. He had done his duty. He had acquired the key to his fortune. Now, he just had to lock it away where he would never have to see it again. The journey north was a silent, 4-day ordeal conducted in a carriage that seemed to absorb the pervasive dampness of the autumn landscape. The air grew colder with every mile, the greens of the south giving way to the grim browns and purples of the moors. Rain began on the second day, a persistent, miserable drizzle that turned the roads to mire and streaked the world outside the carriage windows into a watercolor blur of gray on gray. Inside, the silence was a heavy, sodden blanket. Alistair sat opposite her, his long legs stretched out, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape he did not see. He was already in London in his mind, already seated at his desk, the walls of his study a fortress against the untidy demands of human connection. Alara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She had a new dress, a serviceable traveling gown of dark wool, purchased with a small advance from the solicitor. It felt alien against her skin, a costume for a role she had not yet learned. She watched the Duke from beneath her lashes. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to her since the ceremony, a cold, perfunctory affair in a stone-cold church with only her uncle and Mr. Hemlock as witnesses. He had placed a heavy gold band on her finger, his touch impersonal and brief, and then he had handed her into the carriage as if she were a parcel to be delivered. He was, she thought, a man who had built walls around himself so high and so thick that he had forgotten what the sun felt like. He was magnificent, in a severe, forbidding way, all sharp angles and controlled power, but he was also a ruin, as much as the house they were traveling to was rumored to be. She did not expect kindness. Kindness was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Her parents had died of fever when she was 10, leaving her with nothing but a good name and a weak constitution. She had spent the last decade as a companion, a shadow in other people's houses, enduring the petty cruelties and casual condescensions of her employers. She had learned to be quiet, to be observant, to make herself small. But she had also learned to read ledgers, to manage a household, to stretch a shilling until it screamed. She had learned to survive. This marriage was not a fairy tale. It was an escape. She was exchanging one form of prison for another, but this new prison was one in which she would, at least, hold the keys. On the fourth day, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a rutted track. The trees grew thicker, their branches clawing at the carriage roof. The air smelled of wet earth, of decay, of the salt-laced wind of the nearby sea. After another mile, the trees fell away, and she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a house. It was a wound in the landscape. It crouched on a low hill, a sprawling mass of blackened granite, its multitude of windows like vacant eyes staring out at the relentless gray sky. Gables and chimneys jutted out at odd angles, some of them crumbling. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, had consumed an entire wing, its dark leaves slick with rain. The gardens were a tangled wilderness, the lawns a morass of weeds and mud. It was worse than the rumors. It was a rotting tooth in the mouth of the world. The carriage lurched to a halt before a set of immense, rust-streaked iron gates. A man, old and bent against the wind, struggled to pull one of them open just wide enough for the carriage to pass. He did not look at them, his face hidden beneath a dripping hat. As they rolled up the drive, the full scale of the neglect became apparent. The facade was stained with green and black mildew. A shutter hung from a single hinge, banging a mournful, rhythmic tattoo in the wind. Of the dozens of chimneys, only one issued a weak, anemic plume of smoke. The carriage stopped. The coachman, a man as taciturn as his master, opened the door. The wind immediately swept in, cold and damp, carrying the scent of cold ash and the sea. Alistair stepped out first, his tall frame a stark silhouette against the gloom. He did not offer her a hand. Alara gathered her skirts and descended, her thin-soled shoes sinking immediately into the soft, muddy gravel. The rain plastered a stray strand of hair to her cheek. She looked from the monstrous house to the man who was now her husband. He was already turning away, his attention on the coachman. "Unhitch the bags. You will take me to the posting inn at North Cross. I will arrange for a faster horse from there." The front door of the manor creaked open, and a woman stood framed in the opening. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine that seemed to absorb what little light there was. Her face was a mask of pinched disapproval. This, Alara surmised, was the welcome party. Alistair finally turned to her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were distant, already 1,000 miles away. "This is Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper," he said, the introduction clipped and perfunctory. "She will see you settled." He looked at the house, a brief, dismissive glance. "This is your domain now, Duchess. You have the settlement funds. Use them as you see fit." His gaze met hers, and for a second, she saw a flicker of something bleak and weary in their depths. "Try not to trouble me." It was not a request. It was an order, an abdication. He was leaving her here to preside over this mausoleum. The unspoken sentiment hung in the air between them, as cold and sharp as the wind. Go ahead and die. Just do it quietly. He did not wait for a reply. He gave a curt nod, turned his back on her, and walked toward the waiting coachman, who was already strapping his valise to his saddle horse. He did not look back. Not once. Alara stood alone in the rain and the mud, the cold seeping into her bones. Before her stood the decaying hulk of Blackwood Manor. In its doorway stood a housekeeper whose hostility was a palpable force. Behind her, the sound of hoofbeats faded down the drive, a sound of final, absolute abandonment. She drew in a breath, and the damp air provoked a harsh, rattling cough that bent her double. When she straightened, she tasted blood on the back of her tongue. She looked up at the house, at its vacant, weeping windows. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and this was her kingdom of ruin. The room they gave her was vast, cold, and funereal. It was in the main wing, a state bedroom designed to impress visitors who had not come for half a century. A colossal, canopied bed stood like a tomb in the center, its dark velvet hangings smelling of dust and mildew. The air was so cold her breath plumed in front of her face. A fire had been lit in the grate, but it was a pathetic, sulking thing that produced more smoke than heat, the wood hissing with dampness. The wind moaned through the ill-fitting window frames, a constant, mournful dirge, and a steady drip, drip, drip from a leak somewhere in the ceiling punctuated the gloom, each drop landing on the warped floorboards with the finality of a clock ticking toward doom. Mrs. Gable had shown her to the room with a grim satisfaction, her every movement conveying a sense of martyrdom and disapproval. His Grace's late mother preferred these chambers, she had said, the words a clear indication that Alara was an unworthy usurper. "We have done our best to air it out." It was a lie. The room had not been aired in years. It had been sealed, a time capsule of decay. For the first week, Alara felt herself shrinking. The house was actively trying to kill her. The dampness settled in her lungs, turning her persistent cough into a deep, tearing affliction that left her breathless and weak. She spent most of her time huddled in the monstrous bed, buried under a mountain of musty blankets, shivering. The food that was brought to her was bland and lukewarm, served with the same resentful silence that pervaded the entire house. The staff, what little of it there was, a handful of aging servants who moved like ghosts through the cavernous halls, were Mrs. Gable's creatures. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was the Duke's Folly, a sickly little bird he had brought here to die, and they were all waiting for her to oblige them. She lay in the dark, listening to the house groan and settle around her, listening to the wind and the rain and the steady, maddening drip. She thought of the Duke, of his cold eyes and his final, dismissive words. He had abandoned her here. He had paid for her, and now he had discarded her. A wave of despair, so potent it was nauseating, washed over her. It would be so easy to simply let go, to let the cold and the dampness claim her, to fade away in this grand, rotting bed and become another ghost in a house already full of them. Her uncle had his money. The Duke had his freedom. Her part in the transaction was over. The drip from the ceiling continued its merciless rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. She stared into the gloom, her body aching, her chest a knot of pain. This was how it ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper in a cold, forgotten room. And then something shifted. A tiny, hard kernel of defiance that had been forged in a decade of slights and hardships began to glow with a cold, white-hot fury. She had not survived poverty, orphanhood, and the casual cruelty of wealthy relatives to be defeated by a draft and a leaky roof. She had not clawed her way out of servitude to simply surrender to mildew. The Duke had told her to die quietly. She would not give him the satisfaction. The thought was a jolt of electricity. It was clarity. She was not a guest here, waiting to expire. She was the Duchess. This house, this ruin, this miserable pile of stone and rot. It was hers. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she threw back the heavy blankets. The cold air hit her like a slap, but it was invigorating. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet hitting the frigid, damp floor. Shivering, she stood, her nightgown hanging off her thin frame. She looked around the cavernous, oppressive room. It was a tomb, and she was done living in it. She walked to the bell pull and gave it a sharp, vicious tug. She waited, her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw set. Minutes passed. Finally, the door creaked open and a young maid, her face pale and frightened, peeked in. "You rang, Your Grace?" the girl whispered, as if afraid the sound would wake the dead. "Yes," Elara said, her voice raspy but firm. It was the first command she had issued in this house. "Pack my things. All of them." The maid stared at her, bewildered. "Pack them, Your Grace? Or are you leaving?" Hope flickered in the girl's eyes. "No," Elara said, a grim smile touching her lips for the first time. "I am moving, and then you will fetch me the household account books. All of them. And an axe." The shift was immediate and seismic. Elara abandoned the cavernous staterooms, a wing she ordered closed and shuttered against the encroaching winter. She chose for herself a suite of smaller rooms in a more sheltered part of the house, ones with southern exposure, smaller windows, and a fireplace that, once the chimney was properly swept, drew magnificently. She directed the moving of the furniture herself, ignoring Mrs. Gable's scandalized protests. The monstrous, funereal bed was left to rot in the dark. She chose a smaller, simpler one and had it placed near the hearth. For the first time in weeks, she was warm. The warmth was a revelation. It spread through her limbs, loosening the icy grip on her lungs. Her cough began to ease. She was no longer a dying woman. She was a living one, and she had work to do. The account books were a disaster. They were a testament to decades of neglect and mismanagement. Bills unpaid, rents uncollected, expenses logged with a vagueness that bordered on fraud. Mrs. Gable had been running the house on a dwindling allowance from the Duke's solicitors, supplementing it by selling off assets. A piece of silver here, a tapestry there, for a fraction of their worth. The estate was bleeding to death. Alara sat at a small, practical desk in her new parlor, the fire crackling beside her, and she began to wage war. She did not wage it with swords or cannon, but with a quill pen and a sharp, incisive mind. She spent days poring over the ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration, ink staining her fingers. She mapped the estate's holdings, the tenant farms, the fallow fields, the woodlands. She wrote letters, curt, concise, demanding letters to merchants who had been overcharging for substandard goods. Firm, fair letters to tenants whose rents were in arrears, offering practical payment plans instead of threats. A blunt, non-negotiable letter to the Duke's solicitor in London, informing him that she, the Duchess of Blackwood, was now in sole charge of the manor's finances and that all future disbursements were to be made directly to her. Mrs. Gable watched this flurry of activity with open hostility. The late Duchess never concerned herself with such vulgar matters, she sniffed, finding Alara in the study one afternoon. Alara did not look up from the ledger she was scrutinizing. The late Duchess also presided over a house that was solvent. I do not have that luxury. She made a sharp notation in the margin. Tell me, Mrs. Gable, why have we been purchasing 50 pounds of flour a week when there are only 8 souls in this house, and the bread you serve is perpetually stale? The housekeeper drew herself up, her face flushing a dull red. I will not be questioned on my management of this household. You will, Alara said, her voice quiet but laced with steel. She finally looked up, her gray eyes pinning the older woman in place. Because as of this moment, you are dismissed from that role. You may retain your position as housekeeper, but you will no longer have any authority over the stores or the accounts. You will bring your keys to me within the hour. It was a declaration of war. For a moment, she thought the woman might refuse, might rally the other servants against her. But Alara had not just been studying books. She had been studying people. She had noticed the way the younger maids flinched from the housekeeper's sharp tongue, the way the old cook's shoulders slumped in defeat. Mrs. Gable's power was built on fear and inertia, and Alara had just kicked out the foundations. The woman stared, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, and then, without another word, she turned and swept from the room. An hour later, a heavy ring of iron keys was placed on Alara's desk with a resentful clatter. The takeover had begun. She started with the heart of the house, the kitchen. She found the cavernous, stone-flagged room cold and barely used. The cook, a woman named Mrs. Potter, was apathetic and beaten down. Alara did not chastise her. She asked questions. She learned that the main ovens were broken, the larder was poorly organized, and Mrs. Gable had forbidden the use of the kitchen garden, preferring to buy wilted vegetables from the village. Alara's solution was practical. She found the groundsman, a quiet, weathered man named Finch, and asked him about the garden. He looked at her with surprise, his hands twisting a worn cap. No one had asked him about the garden in 20 years. Together, they walked the overgrown patch of land. He pointed out where the soil was best, where the sun hit what used to grow there. His voice, at first hesitant, grew animated as he spoke of herbs and root vegetables, of the espaliered apple trees that were now wild and tangled, but could be saved. Can you make it produce again? Alara asked. Ah, your grace, he said, a spark of life in his tired eyes. With help. And seeds. You will have both, she promised. She did more. She discovered a clutch of children living wild in the woods at the edge of the estate, stealing eggs from the hen house to survive. They were the orphans of a tenant farmer who had died the previous winter. They were thin and feral, their faces smudged with dirt. Mrs. Gable had wanted to send them to the workhouse. Alara, remembering her own precarious childhood, did something else. She brought them to the house. She had them washed and fed, and then she put them to work. The 2 boys, strong despite their malnourishment, were assigned to Finch in the gardens. The girl, who was clever with her hands, was set to helping Mrs. Potter in the kitchen. They were wary at first, like wild animals, but the steady warmth of the kitchen and the simple dignity of a full belly began to tame them. Slowly, miraculously, the house began to breathe again. The unused wings were boarded up, consolidating their resources. The vast, echoing spaces were closed off, and life was concentrated in a smaller, more manageable core. Finch and his new apprentices reclaimed the kitchen garden, and soon the scent of rosemary and thyme hung in the air. The smell of baking bread, real bread, began to emanate from the kitchens, where Mrs. Potter, revitalized by a purpose and a functioning oven that Alara had paid a traveling tinker to repair, had rediscovered her art. The drip in Alara's old bedroom was fixed, along with a dozen other leaks in the roof over the main block of the house. Money from the judicious leasing of some unused pasture land paid for the repairs. She sold a crumbling, useless folly in a far-flung corner of the park for its stone and used the proceeds to buy a sow and 2 new milk cows. The house was transforming. It was no longer a tomb. It was becoming a fortress, a practical, working, self-sufficient fortress against the cold, the wind, and the world. The chill in the air was still there, but now it was the crisp, clean chill of autumn, not the damp, creeping rot of decay. The scent of mildew was being replaced by the smells of wood smoke, beeswax, and baking apples. The loyalty of the staff, from Finch to the lowest kitchen maid, had shifted slowly but irrevocably. They did not serve the absent Duke. They served the Duchess who was there, the woman with ink on her fingers and mud on her boots, the woman who had brought their home back from the dead. Alara, standing at her window one evening, looked out at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the warm lights glowing in the windows, and felt a sense of ownership so fierce it was a physical ache in her chest. She had not merely survived. She had conquered. 2 years. 2 years Alastair had spent in the gilded cage of London, playing the games of power and politics that he despised. He moved through the drawing rooms and ministries of the capital like a ghost at a feast, his title a shield and his reputation as a ruthless negotiator's sword. He had secured the finances his grandfathers had dangled before him, and he had used them to prop up the crumbling edifice of his family's obligations. He had drained fens, financed mills, and settled disputes, all with a cold, detached efficiency that earned him respect and fear in equal measure. But had cost him. The hollow space inside him had grown, the ghosts of the men he had seen die on muddy battlefields his only constant companions. He was exhausted, not in his body, but in his soul. The artifice of society, the endless, grasping hands, the sycophantic smiles, it had all become unbearable. He had received 1 letter from his solicitor regarding Blackwood Manor in all that time. It had been a brief, perplexed note, stating that Her Grace the Duchess had taken personal control of the manor's accounts and had requested all funds be sent directly to her. He had been surprised, then faintly amused. He had imagined her playing at being a grand lady, squandering the money on fripperies in a futile attempt to brighten the gloom. He had authorized the transfer, dismissing it as the cost of keeping her quiet and out of his way. He had not thought of her since. The black-edged letter he had half expected to receive, announcing her demise, had never arrived. He had assumed she was simply lingering, a pale ghost in a crumbling house. Now, he was returning, not out of any sense of duty to her, but out of a desperate need for silence. He was fleeing the noise of London, the endless demands on the Duke of Blackwood. He wanted a place where no one would speak to him, where the only sound was the wind and the sea. He wanted a tomb. Blackwood Manor, as he remembered it, was the perfect place to go and quietly rust into oblivion. He traveled without fanfare, riding alone, pushing his horse hard through the bleak autumn landscape. He craved the grimness, the stark, unforgiving beauty of the north. It matched the landscape of his own heart. As he turned onto the familiar track leading to the estate, he braced himself for the sight of its decay. He expected the overgrown trees, the rutted drive, the sense of final, irrevocable collapse. He did not expect the gate. It stood tall and straight, the rust gone, the ironwork painted a severe, glossy black. It was closed but not locked. As he pushed it open, he noted the hinges were freshly oiled, It swung without a sound. He rode through, his horse's hooves making a crisp, crunching sound on a drive that was no longer mud and weeds, but fresh, tightly packed gravel. A sense of dislocation settled over him. This was not right. He rounded the final bend, and the house came into view. Alistair pulled his horse to a dead stop. He stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the image in his memory with the one before him. The house was still a grim, imposing mass of granite, but it was no longer a ruin. The ivy had been ruthlessly cut back from the main facade, revealing the clean, strong lines of the stonework beneath. The windows, dozens of them, were no longer vacant eyes. They were clean, gleaming, reflecting the gray sky with a sharp clarity. The broken shutter was gone, replaced, and from at least 5 of the chimneys, thick, healthy plumes of white smoke billowed, a clear and defiant sign of life within. The gardens were not a wilderness. They were orderly, the lawns scythed, the flower beds put to bed for the winter under neat blankets of straw. It was not the rotting tooth he remembered. It was a fortress, stark and formidable, hunkered down against the coming winter. A sense of profound unease, mingled with a baffling curiosity, gripped him. What had happened here? He urged his horse forward, his eyes scanning for some clue, some explanation for this impossible transformation. As he drew near the stables, a boy, no older than 12, sturdy and red-cheeked, came out to meet him, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you, sir?" the boy asked, his tone respectful but not servile. He eyed Alistair's fine horse with a knowledgeable gaze. Alistair was so taken aback by the question that for a moment he could not answer. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He was not a sir to be helped on his own property. "I am the Duke," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. The boy's eyes widened slightly, but he did not quail. He simply nodded. "Ah, we weren't expecting you, Your Grace." "Her Grace is in the study." He took the reins of Alistair's horse with a practiced hand. "I'll see to your mount." "Her Grace." The words hung in the air. The boy's immediate, reflexive mention of her, his assumption that she was the one to be sought, was more telling than anything else. Alistair dismounted, his legs stiff, his mind reeling. He walked toward the main entrance, his boots loud on the gravel. The heavy oak door, which he remembered being swollen and stuck in its frame, was now clearly well-maintained. It opened before he reached it. A young maid in a clean, crisp apron held it wide. She curtsied. "Your Grace. Welcome home. Her Grace is in the West Study." Twice in as many minutes, he had been directed to Her Grace. He was an afterthought in his own house. He strode into the hall, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a sharp, biting irritation. The great hall was no longer a cavern of gloom. The air was cool but not damp, and it smelled of beeswax and drying herbs, which hung in fragrant bunches from the ceiling beams. The vast space was still sparsely furnished, but it was clean, impeccably clean. A large fire roared in the main hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the stone flags. He stripped off his gloves and strode down the corridor toward the West Study, his footsteps echoing in the unfamiliar, living silence of the house. The door to the study was ajar. He pushed it open and stopped on the threshold. The room, which had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, a dusty, book-lined crypt filled with hunting trophies and yellowing maps, was utterly changed. The heavy velvet curtains were gone, replaced by simple linen ones that let in the maximum amount of light. The stuffed heads of long-dead stags were gone. The room was dominated by a large, practical desk, which was positioned not in a gloomy corner, but squarely in the center of the room, where the light was best. And behind that desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and open ledgers, sat his wife. She was not the pale, sickly girl he remembered. Her face still held a certain pallor, but it was the healthy paleness of someone who lived indoors, not the gray wash of illness. Her hair was swept back in a simple, severe knot, and a smudge of ink graced her right cheekbone. She wore a dress of dark blue wool, practical and unadorned, its sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She was bent over a ledger, her brow furrowed in concentration, a pen scratching furiously across the page. She looked magnificent, not beautiful in the conventional drawing room sense. She was too thin, too severe for that. But she was magnificent in her competence, in the absolute, undeniable authority she radiated. She was not a duchess playing at accounts. She was a ruler in her throne room. He must have made a sound, because she looked up. Those startlingly lucid gray eyes widened for a fraction of a second in genuine surprise. Then, her expression settled into a cool, unreadable mask. She put down her pen, carefully, and folded her hands on the desk in front of her. Alistair stared at her, the shock rendering him speechless. The reality of her, strong and vital and utterly in command, was a physical blow. He had expected a ghost. He had found a queen on her throne. "You're alive," he said. The words were blunt, stupid, the only ones his stunned brain could produce. A faint, ironic smile touched her lips. She inclined her head, a gesture of mock deference that was anything but. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace." The air in the study crackled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. Her words, dry and sharp, hung between them. It was not an apology, it was a challenge. Alistair felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar, a mixture of fury, astonishment, and a grudging, infuriating respect. He had left a dying creature here. He had returned to find a monarch, and she was looking at him as if he were an intruder. He stepped fully into the room, letting the door click shut behind him. He was the Duke. This was his house, his study. He would not be made to feel like a trespasser. He walked slowly toward the desk, his eyes taking in the evidence of a reign. The neat stacks of correspondence. The estate maps spread on a side table, marked with new annotations. The ledgers, filled with her clear, decisive script. This was not a hobby. This was a conquest. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. He swept a hand out, indicating the room, the papers her. Alara's gaze followed his gesture, then returned to his face. Her expression remained placid, but her gray eyes were like chips of winter ice. "This, Your Grace, is the administration of Blackwood Manor, a task which, as you may recall, you assigned to me." "I assigned you a residence," he corrected, his voice sharp. "I did not assign you my family's accounts." "The residence was insolvent," she replied, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she were discussing the weather. "It was on the verge of collapse. The staff were unpaid, the tenants were rebellious, and the roof was leaking in 17 different locations. I found it necessary to take matters in hand." "You found it necessary," he repeated, savoring the words with a dangerous quietness. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on her desk, invading her space. He was taller, broader, a physically imposing force, and he used it now to assert the dominance he felt slipping away. "You are the Duchess. Your role is to occupy the house, not to sell its assets and play at being an estate manager." His solicitor's confused letters had mentioned the sale of a folly and the leasing of pasture. At the time, he dismissed it. Now it felt like a violation. She did not flinch. She did not lean back. If anything, she seemed to draw strength from his proximity, her spine becoming even straighter. The folly was a pile of crumbling stone that was a danger to anyone who walked near it. "I sold it for a fair price to a man who needed the stone to build a new barn. The money from that sale paid for a new roof over the kitchens and bought us a breeding pair of pigs. The pasture land you refer to is lying fallow and collecting weeds. I leased it to a sheep farmer from the next valley. The income from that lease has paid for the repairs to the west wing and the wages of the staff for the next 6 months." She paused, her eyes holding his. "I have not played at anything, Your Grace. I have been ensuring the survival of this estate." "Your estate," every word, was a perfectly aimed dart of irrefutable logic. She was not defensive. She was stating facts. He found himself with no ground to stand on. He, who could dismantle a minister's argument in Parliament without raising his voice, was being systematically disarmed by a woman he had married for her bloodline and dismissed as a consumptive inconvenience. He straightened up, turning away from the desk, to pace the length of the room. He needed to regain control of the situation, of himself. You overstepped your authority. I had no authority, she shot back, her voice rising for the first time. You left me here with a hostile housekeeper, a crumbling house, and an order to not trouble you. I was given a choice: lie down and die as you so clearly expected, or get up and fight. I chose to fight. He stopped, his back to her. Her words struck a nerve, a raw, exposed place he kept hidden from the world. Lie down and die, or to get up and fight. It was the story of his own life, the choice he faced every single morning. He had not expected to hear from her. He turned back slowly. The staff, they answer to you. It was not a question. He had seen it in the boy's eyes, in the maid's deference. The staff answer to the person who sees that they are fed, housed, and paid, she said simply. For the past 2 years, that person has been me. Their loyalty is not to a title, but to a provider. It is a lesson in governance, I am sure you, of all people, understand. The cynical pragmatism of her statement was so perfectly aligned with his own worldview that he almost laughed. It was absurd. He had searched all of England for a quiet, biddable, forgettable wife, and he had accidentally shackled himself to the one woman in the kingdom who thought exactly as he did. A knock at the door broke the standoff. The young maid from the hall entered, carrying a tray. She curtsied, her eyes carefully averted from the Duke's thunderous expression. Your tea, Your Grace, she said, placing the tray on a small table near the fire. Then she looked at Alara. And I brought a fresh pot for you as well. Mrs. Potter has just taken a seed cake from the oven. If you'd like a slice, the offer was warm, personal. Thank you, Mary. That sounds lovely, Alara said, her voice softening. The maid curtsied again and scurried out, closing the door behind her. The simple domestic exchange was a more powerful demonstration of Alara's position than any ledger. She was not just the mistress of the house. She was its heart, the center of its new, thriving life. Alistair was the outsider, the foreign body, the intruder. He watched as Alara rose from the desk and went to the tea tray. She moved with a fluid economy of motion, her earlier frailty completely gone, replaced by a wiry strength. She picked up the teapot. You are my husband and the master of this house, she said, her back to him. Her voice was cool and formal again. The fire of their argument banked. Your rooms in the East Wing have been kept aired and ready. I will have a fire lit and hot water brought up for you. She was dismissing him. Politely, correctly, but it was a dismissal nonetheless. She was sending him to his rooms while she got on with her work. He walked over to the fireplace, standing beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the hearth. He looked down at her. I am not thirsty. Then I will have a bath drawn, she said, not looking at him. I do not want a bath. She finally turned her head, her gaze sweeping up to meet his. Then what is it you want, Your Grace? The question was loaded. It was not about tea or baths. It was about power. It was about his presence here in her world. He did not know how to answer. 2 days ago, he would have said he wanted silence, solitude, a grave. But standing here, in this room that hummed with quiet purpose, facing this woman who had stared into the abyss and refused to fall, he felt the first flicker of something other than exhaustion in a very long time. It was a sharp, unsettling, and intensely compelling curiosity. I want, he said slowly, the words forming themselves as he spoke, to see the books. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. It was the last thing she had expected him to say. He was not demanding his authority back. He was not ordering her to stop. He was asking to be let in. For a long moment, she just looked at him, her expression a complex mixture of suspicion and surprise. Then she gave a single sharp nod. Very well, she said, turning back to the tea tray. She poured a single cup, her hand perfectly steady, and handed it to him. You should have it anyway. You look half dead. The bluntness of it, the utter lack of deference, was so shocking he took the cup without thinking. He, the Duke of Blackwood, stood there holding a cup of tea he did not want, having just been told he looked like a corpse by his own wife. And as he looked at her, standing resolute and defiant in the firelight, he realized his carefully constructed world had just been tilted entirely off its axis. The storm rolled in off the sea just after dusk, a black-bellied beast of a thing that swallowed the last of the light. It started with a low, guttural moan of wind that rattled the window panes in their frames, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Alistair, sitting in the study across the desk from Alara, felt the shift in the atmosphere as a physical pressure against his skin. For hours, they had worked in a tense, charged silence, pouring over the estate ledgers. He had expected to find chaos, amateurish mistakes. Instead, he found meticulous order, ruthless efficiency, and a shrewd understanding of finance that would have impressed his own solicitors. She had not just saved the manor, she had made it profitable. The realization was both galling and deeply impressive. He watched her as she worked, the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, the firelight catching the stray wisps of hair that had escaped her severe knot. She was a puzzle he could not solve. He had built his life on the principle of control, of understanding every variable. She was a variable he had not even known existed, and she had rearranged his entire equation without his permission. Then the first crack of thunder came. It was not a distant rumble, but a sharp, violent explosion directly overhead, as if the sky itself had been torn in two. The force of it shook the house to its foundations. The oil lamps flickered wildly, casting leaping, distorted shadows on the walls. Alistair froze. His hand, which had been turning a page, clenched into a fist, crushing the paper. The sound, the sudden, deafening blast, was not thunder. It was cannon fire. He was not in a study in the north of England. He was outside a field hospital in Portugal, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, the screams of wounded men drowned out by the ceaseless, percussive roar of the artillery. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The walls of the room seemed to press in on him, the air growing thick and suffocating. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead. "That was a close one," Alara remarked, her voice calm, though she had startled at the sound. She glanced up at him. "Your Grace." He could not answer. He could not draw a proper breath. His gaze was fixed on the window, where a brilliant, searing flash of lightning momentarily bleached the world white, followed an instant later by another cataclysmic boom of thunder. Incoming. The word screamed through his mind. He was exposed. He needed cover. His muscles coiled, his body screaming at him to run, to dive for the dirt, to find shelter from the relentless, sky-splitting bombardment. His carefully constructed facade, the iron control he had cultivated for years, was shattering like glass. Alara saw the change in him. It was not subtle. The color had drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, corpse-like gray. His eyes, fixed on the window, were wide with a terror that was stark and absolute. His knuckles were white where he gripped the desk. He was not the cold, arrogant Duke anymore. He was a man drowning in some private, unseen horror. Alistair. She used his given name without thinking, the title seeming absurdly inadequate for the raw panic she saw on his face. He flinched at the sound of his name, his head snapping toward her. His eyes were unfocused, seeing something else, something she could not. He looked trapped, hunted. Another blast of thunder, louder this time, shook the very floorboards, and he made a choked, guttural sound, pushing himself away from the desk so violently that his chair scraped back and nearly toppled over. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. Alara's first instinct was a cold, detached curiosity. This was the man who had abandoned her, who had treated her with such callous disdain. Seeing his formidable armor crack was, on some level, satisfying. But the terror in his eyes was not a weakness to be exploited. It was a wound, deep and festering. It was the look of an animal caught in a trap, and despite everything, a different instinct took over, the pragmatic, problem-solving instinct that had become her nature. He was breaking. Here, in her study. She rose slowly, her movements calm and deliberate, as if approaching a spooked horse. "It's just a storm," she said, her voice even and low. "It will pass." He didn't seem to hear her. He backed away until his shoulders hit the bookshelves, his head turning from side to side, scanning the room for a threat only he could see. The wind howled outside, a chorus of shrieking demons, and the rain began to lash against the glass like thrown gravel. The storm was feeding his panic, every sound a new assault. "They're too close," he rasped, his voice a raw whisper. The range, they've found the range. She understood then. The war he had returned from, hollowed out and silent. This was not just a memory, he was reliving it. The storm had thrown him back onto a battlefield. Platitudes would be useless. Pity would be an insult. He needed an anchor, something solid to cling to in the maelstrom of his own mind. She walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from him. She did not try to touch him. "There are no cannon," she said, her voice firm, declarative. "There is only rain and wind. You are at Blackwood Manor. You are in the study. Look at me." He wouldn't. His eyes were darting around the room, the shadows thrown by the lamp twisting into menacing shapes. He was losing the fight, sinking deeper. She had to pull him out. She scanned the room, her practical mind searching for a tool. Her gaze fell on the heavy, velvet curtain pulls. An idea, unconventional and risky, sparked. She went to the window, the source of his terror, and with a decisive tug, pulled the heavy drapes shut, plunging the room into a deeper gloom, lit only by the fire and the single lamp on the desk. The sound of the rain was instantly muffled, the terrifying flashes of lightning blocked. "There," she said, her voice cutting through the noise in his head. "The view is obscured. They cannot see us." She was speaking his language, the language of tactics, of survival. He blinked, his focus shifting slightly. He looked at the closed curtains, then at her. A flicker of confusion warred with the panic in his eyes. "Obscured," he repeated, the word a piece of driftwood for his drowning mind. "Yes," she said, moving closer. "We are in a fortified position. The walls are 3 feet thick. Granted, they will not be breached." She was not offering comfort. She was giving a tactical assessment. She pointed to the desk. "That is not a map table. It is a desk. Those are not casualty reports. They are account books." She picked up one of the ledgers. "This is the record for the dairy. We have 3 milk cows. They produced 50 gallons of milk last month. See," she held out to him. He stared at the book, at the neat columns of figures. His breathing was still ragged, but the frantic, hunted look in his eyes was beginning to recede, replaced by a profound, exhausted confusion. He was caught between 2 worlds, the bloody past and the solid, baffling present. Another roll of thunder, more distant this time, rumbled through the house. He flinched, but it was a lesser reaction, an echo of the earlier terror. He leaned his head back against the bookshelves, closing his eyes. "God," he whispered, the word a prayer and a curse. Alara stood before him, the ledger still in her hand. She had seen the man beneath the Duke's armor. She had seen the raw, splintered thing that all his power and privilege was built to conceal. And in that moment of shared crisis, seeing his profound vulnerability, the wall of her own resentment began to crumble, not into forgiveness, but into a complex, grudging understanding. They were both survivors, just of different wars. She set the ledger down on the desk. She walked to the small table where the tea tray still sat. The pot would be cold by now. Without a word, she went to the bell pull and gave it a tug. She would have fresh, hot tea brought up. It was a practical thing to do. It was all she knew how to do. When she turned back, he was watching her, his eyes lucid now and filled with a bleak, raw shame. The storm outside was beginning to pass. The one inside the room was just beginning. The aftermath of the storm was a profound and heavy quiet. The rain softened to a whisper against the glass, and the wind's howl gentled into a mournful sigh. Inside the study, the silence was even deeper, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Alistair sat in a chair by the hearth, not the one he had occupied before, but a worn leather wingback that had been his grandfather's. He had sunk into it, as if his bones could no longer support his own weight. The terrible, raw vulnerability of his breakdown had passed, leaving in its wake a mortifying clarity. He felt stripped bare, his defenses dismantled and left in ruins around him. Alara had not said a word. After ringing for fresh tea, she had simply returned to her side of the desk, not to work, but to wait. She sat with her hands folded, her posture relaxed, her gaze directed at the fire. She was giving him space, a silence that was not judgmental or pitying, but merely present. It was an act of unexpected, undemanding grace, and it was more unsettling to him than any accusation would have been. He had shown her his deepest, most shameful weakness, the hidden wound he had carried for years. He had expected revulsion, or perhaps a flicker of triumph in her eyes. He saw neither. He saw only a quiet, watchful stillness. Mary arrived with the tea, her eyes flicking nervously between the pale, silent Duke and the calm Duchess. She set the tray down and fled without a word. Alara rose and prepared a cup, adding a generous splash of brandy from a decanter on a side table. A decanter she had unearthed from some forgotten cabinet. She brought the cup to him, her movements efficient and devoid of any fussy solicitude. She held it out. "Drink this." He took it, his hand not quite steady. The warmth of the porcelain was a grounding sensation. He looked up at her, standing before him, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You saw," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. It was not a question. "I saw a man caught in a storm," she replied, her voice even. She did not sit back down. Instead, she leaned a shoulder against the stone mantelpiece, looking into the flames. "The house is old. It makes noises in the wind." She was offering him an excuse, a way to pretend it had been nothing more than a startle. A polite fiction. He shook his head, the movement slow, weary. He would not take the escape she offered. The pretense was shattered. Rebuilding it felt like a colossal waste of energy. "It was not the house," he said. He took a long swallow of the hot, brandy-laced tea. The spirit burned a welcome path down his throat. It was the sound. The artillery, the admission cost him, but the words, once spoken, seemed to lessen their terrible weight. In Portugal, there was a bombardment that lasted for 18 hours. We were pinned down in a ravine. The shells kept falling short, hitting our own lines. He stopped, staring in his cup, seeing not tea, but mud and blood. They sounded just like that. The crack, then the roar. He had never spoken of this to anyone. Not to his fellow officers, not to his family, not to the fawning politicians who clapped him on the back and called him a hero. To speak of it was to give it a reality he fought every day to deny. Alara was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire. He braced himself for her response. Pity, perhaps, or a clumsy attempt at understanding. He did not expect the quiet, practical observation that came next. "It is a flaw in the design, then," she said, her tone analytical. "To build a fortress of granite on a high hill in a land of frequent thunderstorms. The acoustics are a liability." He stared at her. She had taken his confession of trauma and reframed it not as a personal failing, but as a logistical problem, a flaw in the design. The sheer, unexpected pragmatism of it was like a bucket of cold, clean water to the face. It was absurd, and it was brilliant. A laugh, a genuine, rust-coated sound he had not heard from himself in years, escaped him. It was short and harsh, but it was a laugh nonetheless. "A flaw in the design," he repeated, a slow smile touching his lips. "Yes, I suppose it is." She glanced at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something soft in her cool gray eyes. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, a shared understanding of a world that was fundamentally flawed and had to be managed, not mourned. "Most things are," she said quietly. She pushed herself off the mantelpiece. "The ledgers can wait until morning." She walked back to the desk, beginning to neatly stack the papers, her movements indicating that the strange, intense intimacy of the last hour was over. It was time to restore order. He watched her, a new awareness dawning. He had come back to this house, seeking a tomb, a place to be alone with his ghosts. He had found a woman who was not afraid of ghosts. She simply assessed them, noted their liabilities, and then got on with the practical business of living. He finished his tea, the warmth spreading through him. The exhaustion was still there, a deep, bone-weary ache, but it was different now. It was no longer the hollow fatigue of despair, but the simple tiredness that comes after a long, hard fight. The storm inside him had not vanished, but it had broken. The shelling had stopped. He stood up, placing the empty cup on the mantel. Alara paused in her tidying, watching him. The power dynamic that had defined their earlier confrontation had vanished, replaced by a fragile, uncertain truce. "My rooms," he said. "You said they were in the East Wing." "Yes," she confirmed. "Mary will have lit the fire by now." He nodded. He should leave. He should go to his solitary rooms and let her have her space, her study, her world. But he found himself reluctant to go. The silence in this room, which a few hours ago had been a battleground, now felt like a sanctuary. "Alara," he said, the name still feeling foreign on his tongue. She looked at him, waiting. He did not know what to say. "Thank you" felt inadequate and absurd. "I'm sorry" felt like a betrayal of the strange, respectful truce they had forged. So he said the only practical, honest thing he could think of. "The accounts for the North tenants," he said, his voice regaining some of its customary command, but without the hard, dismissive edge. "The rents you've set are too low. The soil there is better than you've accounted for. We can get another 10% without causing hardship." She stared at him, her head tilted. Then a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It transformed her, chasing the severity from her features and lighting her gray eyes with a startling warmth. "I will take it under advisement, Your Grace," she said, the formal title now laced with a rich, shared irony. He gave a curt nod, the closest he could come to a smile in return, and then he turned and walked out of the study, leaving her in the warm, quiet light of the fire. For the first time since he had come home from the war, he did not feel entirely alone. In the days that followed, a new, unspoken rhythm established itself at Blackwood Manor. The fragile truce forged in the firelight of the study solidified into a quiet, working partnership. Alistair did not retreat to his rooms in the East Wing as a recluse. Instead, after a long night's sleep, a deeper, more restorative sleep than he had known in years, he found himself drawn back to the study. He entered the next morning to find Alara already there, a fresh pot of tea steaming on the side table and a space cleared for him at the massive desk. She did not comment on his presence. She simply pushed a stack of papers toward him. "The forestry reports," she said. "Finch says there's a stand of old oak that could be selectively logged. I am not certain of the timber's value." And so they began. They did not speak of the storm, or of the war, or of the 2 years of neglect that lay between them. They spoke of timber prices, of crop rotation, of mending fences and re-roofing barns. He brought his vast, theoretical knowledge of the duchy's management, his understanding of the wider economic and political currents. She brought her fierce, hard-won, practical knowledge of this specific patch of earth, her intimate understanding of its soil, its people, its myriad failings and hidden strengths. He thought in terms of decades and bloodlines. She thought in terms of the coming winter and the spring planting. Together, they were formidable. He found a strange satisfaction in the work. The problems of the estate were concrete, tangible. You could mend a wall. You could drain a field. You could look at a column of figures and, through logic and effort, make it balance. It was clean, honest work, a world away from the smoke and mirrors of London, the shifting allegiances and whispered lies. It was grounding. He began to feel the edges of his own brokenness starting to knit back together, not through forgetting the past, but by focusing on the solid reality of the present. One afternoon, he found her not in the study, but in the stables. She had her sleeves rolled up, her hair escaping its pins, and she was arguing with Finch over the proper treatment for a sick cow. There was a smudge of something unpleasant on her cheek, and her boots were caked in mud and worse. She was holding a pail, and her expression was one of fierce, focused concern. A group of his London acquaintances would have fainted at the sight of a duchess in such a state. Alistair found he did not care. He saw not the grime, but the competence. "It's a lung fever," Finch was insisting, his face grim. "Shall not make it through the week." "It is not," Alara countered, her voice sharp with conviction. Her breathing is clear. Look at her eyes. It's a digestive complaint. She's eaten something she shouldn't have. She glanced up and saw Alistair standing in the doorway. She did not flush or try to hide her disheveled state. She simply nodded a brief acknowledgement and turned back to the cow. We need to drench her. A mixture of salt, molasses, and ale. It will clear her gut. Finch looked skeptical, shaking his head. The old ways say to bleed them for a fever. The old ways will kill her, Elara snapped. She thrust the pail she was holding at Alistair. Your Grace, make yourself useful. Hold this. He took it automatically, stunned into obedience. Finch and the stable boys stared, wide-eyed, as the Duke of Blackwood stood in the middle of their stable, holding a pail of what looked like medicinal sludge. Elara, oblivious to the tableau she had created, was already murmuring to the cow, her hand stroking the animal's flank with a surprising gentleness. Later, after the cow had been drenched and seemed to be breathing easier, he found her by the water pump, vigorously scrubbing her hands and arms. You gave me an order, he stated, his voice neutral. She glanced at him, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. She did not apologize. You were standing there, and my hands were full. It was a matter of practicality. And if I had refused? He asked, genuinely curious. She stopped scrubbing and looked him full in the face, water dripping from her elbows. I would have managed, she said simply. I always do, but it was faster with your help. She turned back to the pump, the conversation over, and Alistair realized that in her world, his title meant very little. His utility, however, was something she could appreciate. It was, he thought, the most honest assessment of his worth he had ever received. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the tense, watchful silence of their first days together, nor the empty, hostile silence of their carriage ride. It became a comfortable, companionable quiet, the silence of two people working toward a common goal. They could spend hours in the study without speaking, the only sounds the scratch of their pens and the rustle of paper, and feel no need to fill the space with meaningless chatter. One evening, they were working late, trying to untangle a particularly knotty boundary dispute with a neighboring landowner. The fire had burned low, and the room had grown cold. Alistair, lost in thought, shivered. Before he could think to rise and add a log to the fire, Elara was already moving. She went to the hearth, picked up the heavy iron poker, and skillfully rearranged the embers, adding 2 large logs from the basket beside it. She knelt there for a moment, her profile illuminated by the sudden flare of new flames, her expression focused and serene. He watched her, and a strange, unbidden thought came to him. This is what a home feels like. It was not the grandeur of his London house or the history of his family's primary seat. It was this, a shared task, a comfortable silence, a simple act of care performed without comment or expectation of thanks. As she rose, her hand brushed against the rough stone of the mantelpiece, and she winced, pulling it back. A splinter, she murmured, more to herself than to him. He was on his feet before he knew it. Let me see, he took her hand. Her skin was cool, her fingers stained with ink. A small, dark splinter was embedded in the soft pad of her palm. Her hands were not the smooth, useless hands of an aristocrat. They were the hands of a worker, calloused and capable. His touch was gentle as he examined the injury. It was a simple thing, but the contact sent a jolt through him, a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Her skin was soft against his. For a moment, he forgot the splinter, forgot the study, forgot everything but the feeling of her hand in his. It was not a romantic touch, not a caress. It was grounding, anchoring. It was the touch of another living, breathing person who was solid and real in a world of ghosts. He looked up and found her watching him, her gray eyes wide and searching. The air grew thick again, but this time it was not with tension or terror. It was with a new, unspoken awareness. The partnership, born of practicality and shared crisis, was shifting into something else, something deeper and far more dangerous. He cleared his throat, his voice suddenly husky. There is a pair of tweezers in the top drawer of the desk, he said, his voice all business. He released her hand, the loss of contact leaving his own skin feeling strangely cold. She retrieved them, her movements a little too quick, a little too jerky. They stood by the fire, and in a moment of quiet, intense focus, he carefully extracted the splinter from her palm. Neither of them spoke. The small, intimate act felt more significant than any conversation. When he was done, she simply murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and returned to her side of the desk. But the spell of their working silence was broken. The space between them now hummed with a different kind of energy, a quiet, insistent question that neither of them was ready to answer. The first snow of winter arrived a week later, a silent, swirling curtain of white that transformed the grim landscape into a place of stark, monochromatic beauty. It softened the hard edges of the crags and laid a blanket of peace over the sleeping gardens. Inside the manor, the change was palpable. The fortress Alara had built was now truly tested, and it held. The fires burned brightly, the larders were full, and a sense of cozy, defiant sanctuary settled over the household. The world outside could freeze. They were safe, they were warm, they were provided for. The snow also cut them off. The road to the village became impassable, and the twice-weekly mail coach ceased its run. They were isolated, an island in a sea of white. For Alistair, the isolation was not a confinement. It was a relief. The demands of the outside world, of his title and his duties, faded into a distant murmur. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of this estate, to the stone walls of this house, and, increasingly, to the quiet, formidable presence of the woman who was its heart. The partnership had deepened. They had moved beyond the ledgers. He found himself walking the grounds with her and Finch, discussing drainage and crop yields. He found himself in the kitchens, tasting Mrs. Potter's new batch of preserves and offering an opinion. He was no longer just the Duke, the abstract source of authority. He was becoming part of the living, breathing organism of the house. He was learning its rhythms, its needs, its strengths. He was also learning Alara. He learned that her sharp tongue was a shield for a fiercely protective nature. He learned that her pragmatism was tempered by a deep-seated compassion she tried to hide. He saw it in the way she dealt with the tenant children she had taken in, treating them with a firm but fair hand, ensuring they learned to read and write in the evenings by the kitchen fire. He saw it in the way she knew the name of every servant, knew of their families, their small joys and worries. She was not just their mistress. She was their general, their protector, their queen. And he, the Duke, was slowly, inexplicably becoming her consort. The call of the old world, when it came, was therefore a violent, unwelcome intrusion. It arrived in the form of a man on horseback, a royal courier who had fought his way through the snow-clogged passes, his horse lathered and steaming in the frigid air. He carried an urgent dispatch, sealed with the crest of the Prime Minister himself. The courier was brought into the great hall, stamping snow from his boots, his face raw from the cold. He looked around at the warm, clean, but undeniably rustic hall, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. He handed the leather pouch to Alistair with a stiff bow. "From London, Your Grace. A matter of utmost urgency." Alistair took the pouch. The familiar weight of it, the scent of expensive leather and official wax, felt alien in his hands. It was a relic from another life. He looked over at Alara, who had come to stand by the hearth. Her face was a careful, blank mask, but he saw the immediate shift in her posture. Her defensive walls, which had been slowly, cautiously lowering, snapped back into place. She saw the dispatch, and she saw the world it represented. The world he belonged to, the world that had no place for a practical, ink-stained duchess in a mended wool dress. He broke the seal and read the letter. It was as he expected, a crisis in the cabinet, a key ally threatening to bolt the coalition. His presence, his influence, his ruthless negotiating skills were required. He was being summoned back to the game. 2 months ago, he would have answered the call without a second thought. It was his duty. It was what he did. It was who he was. He looked up from the letter, his gaze finding Alara's across the room. She was watching him, her expression coolly formal. She already knew what the letter said, in essence if not in detail. She expected him to leave. Her entire stance screamed it. She was preparing for his departure, preparing to be abandoned once again, this time not to a ruin, but to the home she had built, which would be just as empty without him. "I will have your things packed, Your Grace," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of all emotion. It was the voice she had used on his first day back, the voice of a subordinate addressing a superior. "The courier's horse will need to be rested, but you should be able to leave by morning, if the pass is clear." The courier, standing by, nodded in agreement. "We can make it, Your Grace. The matter is pressing." Alistair looked from the anxious courier to the cold, distant woman by the fire. He looked at the letter in his hand, the summons back to a life that now felt hollow and meaningless. He thought of the endless, echoing corridors of his London house. He thought of the cloying artifice of the court, the bitter taste of political compromise. He thought of the ghosts that waited for him there, in the silence of his empty rooms. Then he looked around the great hall of Blackwood Manor. He smelled the wood smoke and the beeswax. He heard the distant, happy shout of one of the children from the kitchen. He felt the solid, reassuring quiet of a house that was alive and whole. And he looked at Alara, who had built all of it from nothing, who had faced down his own demons with nothing but a cup of tea and a dose of irrefutable logic. A decision, clear and absolute, settled in his soul. He walked over to the great hearth, the letter still in his hand. Alara watched him, her eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. The courier watched him, a look of confusion on his face. Alistair did not hesitate. He held the Prime Minister's dispatch to the edge of the flames. The corner of the thick paper blackened, curled, and then caught, bursting into a bright orange flower of fire. "Your Grace," the courier gasped, taking a step forward in horror. Alistair did not look at him. He held the letter until the flames licked at his fingertips. Then he dropped the burning remnants onto the logs, where they were swiftly consumed. He turned to the stunned courier, his face calm, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will ride back to London in the morning," he said. "You will tell the Prime Minister that the Duke of Blackwood is in residence at his family seat and is unavailable. You will tell him that my duties are here." The courier stared, speechless, at the man who had just committed an act of political suicide. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then gave a jerky, terrified bow and backed away, eager to escape the presence of a duke who had clearly gone mad. When a man was gone, only the two of them remained in the hall. The silence was absolute. Alara had not moved. She was staring at the spot in the fire where the letter had burned, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Alistair closed the distance between them, stopping directly in front of her. He could feel the tension radiating from her, the lifetime of defensiveness, the expectation of betrayal. He had to tear down that final wall. "Alara," he said, his voice low and raw with an emotion he could no longer name or suppress. She finally looked up at him, her gray eyes glittering with unshed tears, her expression a maelstrom of shock, hope, and terror. "What have you done?" she whispered. "I have made a choice," he said. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture around the hall, at the house that was their shared creation. "My father hated this place. He saw it as a tomb. I came back here seeking the same thing. A place to fade away." He took a step closer, his gaze locked on hers. "But it is not a tomb. You made it a home. You filled it with life, with warmth, with purpose." He paused, gathering the words, the one simple, profound truth he had discovered in the heart of this northern winter. "That life, that purpose, it is mine now, too. My duty is no longer to a crown or a cabinet in London. My duty is here." He reached out then, and his hand came to rest on her arm, a simple, grounding touch. "You are my home, Alara." The last of her defenses shattered. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She did not try to wipe it away. The fierce, unyielding strength that had carried her through so much finally gave way to a vulnerable softness that she only now felt safe enough to reveal. She did not fall into his arms. She leaned, just a little. Her forehead came to rest against his chest, a quiet, complete surrender not to him, but to the truth of what they had become. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. She was so slender, yet she felt as strong and solid as the granite walls of the house around them. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the faint scent of rosemary and old paper that clung to her. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a deep, profound silence. But inside the house, in the warm circle of the firelight, there was no silence. There was the steady, reassuring beat of two hearts. They stood there for a long time, two survivors who had found their fortress. He was no longer the haunted Duke, and she was no longer the pragmatic survivor. They were simply Alistair and Alara, a permanent fixture against the coming winter, in a house that was at long last fiercely alive and completely whole. The partnership had been forged in ledgers and sealed in crisis. Now, in the quiet of the snowbound hall, it was finally becoming a marriage. A real one, built not on a cold transaction, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of shared struggle, mutual respect, and the simple, profound discovery of home.